Genshin Impact's combat system has always been a huge factor for people who enjoy the game, and at the core of the combat is the elements and how they react with each other. Each elemental reaction has unique effects that can be useful in one way or another. These elements and reactions have a set logic to them, which overall makes them easier to understand. But there is one reaction that is never talked about. It is a reaction that is never played, at least not anymore, and that is the reaction of Superconduct. Superconduct is the reaction between Electro and Cryo, two elements that are very good when paired with other elements, but when together they are arguably the worst reaction in the game. I'm bringing this up today because Crystallize and Overload, reactions that used to be really bad, are a lot more useful today thanks to Navia and Chevreuse. Navia utilizes Crystallize to increase her own damage, and Chevreuse makes Overload more like a debuff. So now, as long as you have those two characters, those reactions are much better. So why is Superconduct so bad? First, we need to understand exactly what it does. Superconduct at its core is a debuffing reaction. All it does is decrease the physical resistance of enemies by 40%. Now, at first glance, 40% is a lot, but considering it is physical damage and nothing else, it is extremely lackluster. It's quite interesting how during Genshin Impact's beta, Superconduct decreased enemies' defense by 40%, not just their physical resistance. This was obviously way overpowered, but honestly they could have just decreased that number, maybe to something like 20 or 15%. This would have at least made Superconduct way more versatile, but it kinda would have made the reaction way too much of a jack of all trades. It would have been good in any type of situation, so maybe it was a good thing that it was changed. Now when it comes to who can use the reaction, there are very few characters who can actually utilize this reaction, and most of them would prefer to do anything else, like Hyperbloom for example. And those characters are Eula, Razor, Rosaria, Fremine, and Fischl. Rosaria, Fischl, and Fremine can be physical damage dealers, but they are straight up better utilized somewhere else. Fischl is better in Aggravate or Electrocharge teams, and Rosaria and Fremine are just better in Freeze and Melt teams. It's funny because Fremine is made to shatter, like it's part of his kit, but I'm pretty sure, don't quote me on this, I actually don't know, I haven't researched it, but I'm pretty sure that Fremine just does more damage when he melts. I'm pretty sure that's the case. It's funny because all these characters I mentioned, they're built around physical damage. They're meant to do physical damage. Even Fischl's signature bow is physical damage. Eula, Razor, and Fremine are characters that are based around physical damage too. That's their whole kit. Yet these characters are extremely underused within the Genshin Impact player base. And that all comes down to how poor physical damage is. Like guys, Eula's scaling is ridiculous. Her numbers are insane. And when I mean numbers, I mean her percentage multipliers, not her actual damage, you know? They had to buff her damage up so much just so her physical damage can compete with elemental damage. And that just goes to show how bad physical damage is. It's kind of the same with Geo too actually, because Geo doesn't get a damage multiplier when it does reactions. They have to bump up their multipliers. Even with Superconduct, which reduces enemy physical resistance by a whopping 40%, it is still lackluster. Even though Eula's scaling is ridiculous, her damage is still mediocre. It is legitimately better to play her in a Hyperbloom team, which is hilarious. It is just overall more optimal and more fun to use other reactions. Even Mono Geo is more reliable than Superconduct, a team that doesn't even need elemental reaction to deal damage. And this brings us to the main question of the video. The reasons why Superconduct is forgotten as a reaction and why it is so bad. But we're going to go even further than that and discuss how we can fix the reaction. Now when it comes to fixing Superconduct, the best way we can do this is through the introduction of a new character whose kit revolves around Superconduct. Now the reason for this is because knowing Hoyoverse, they wouldn't straight up buff the reaction. Instead they'll introduce a new character to solve the issue. As mentioned earlier, Navia and Chevreuse are prime examples of this. Navia makes Crystallize more useful since it directly affects how much damage she does, and Chevreuse turns Overload into a debuffing reaction that shreds both Pyro and Electro resistance of enemies when her team hits them with Overload reaction. Because of Chevreuse, Overload teams are actually really viable now. There are multiple Overload teams that work with her. So what can we do to make Superconduct more viable? We could get a future Cryo or Electro character that changes how Superconduct functions similar to Chevreuse and Overload. They could act the same as her and shred Cryo and Electro resistance of enemies affected by the reaction. This is a bit boring though, since that's just a copy and paste of what Chevreuse does. So instead of that, what if it just increased the physical resistance shred? Maybe up to something like 80%. Obviously this is just speculation, but even 80% might not be enough to make physical damage on par with everything else. And honestly, aside from these, I'm really not sure how to make Superconduct better, outside of giving an additional effect. They could just straight up increase the amount of damage the reaction itself does, but I just can't see that happening. It would just become a pseudo melt at that point, you know, and nobody wants that. Anyways guys, what do you all think of Superconduct? When was the last time you actually used the reaction? And be honest, don't say Hyperbloomula, that doesn't count. Do you have any ideas to make it better, directly or indirectly? Let us all know in the comments down below. I personally think that the meta might shift when we go to Snezhnaya, because one thing I've noticed with Genshin Impact is when new regions come out, the meta shifts towards the element of that region. Like when Inazuma came out, Electro got way better, you know, with like Raiden and Yai and Sarah. And then when Sumeru came out, Dendro was brand new, but Dendro teams were amazing. It was all elemental frickin' mastery damage, you know? And now with Fontaine out, Hydro characters are ridiculous. So the natural shift is when Snezhnaya comes out, the nation of Cryo characters are gonna get buffed. Which could mean that Superconduct could get better. Who knows? Anyways, thank you all so much for watching. If you liked this video, make sure to drop a like down below. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you want more content like this. And I'll see you all in the next one.